le otorgamos la palabra al señor Manuel Eisner de la Universidad de Cambridge, Reino Unido, quien moderará esta sesión. Tiene la palabra, señor Eisner.
Welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to chair this session. I will be brief in the introduction so that we each have some time to speak. We're going to limit the speaking time for each of the presenters to 10 minutes so that you still have a chance to have lunch. I just want to briefly guide you through why we have this session. When you look at homicide cases, there is a flow of events from the initial registration of a homicide case to the eventual conviction. And this graph just demonstrates this flow. Currently, UNODC, the World Health Organization, are working very hard to generate comparative data just on the levels of homicide. When we organized this session, the idea was that we need to move beyond just counting homicides. We need to understand what happens to these cases in the systems in different countries. And that is why we put together this panel of experts who are working on the topic of how homicides are processed in different countries. Ultimately, we want to arrive at better data that document the flow of homicide cases in different societies so that we can answer a number of really important questions. We want to better document system functioning across UNODC member states. We want to understand inconsistencies in national homicide data. We want to generate comparable estimates, for example, about impunity, which is a big issue in many countries. But we don't really have a good understanding of how and where societies differ in levels of impunity, how the cases are being lost. And finally, we would like to be able to test hypotheses, for instance, about whether levels of impunity are linked to higher homicide rates. If we want to test this hypothesis, we have the homicide rates, but we don't have testable data that give us an indication of the system functioning in different societies. So that's just by way of introduction. I would like to now invite Marika Lim to give the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. If I may ask, yes, thank you. What I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to share with you some of our experience based on the European Homicide Monitor. Together with my colleagues from Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, and now also Scotland, Denmark and Estonia, we've been able to expand the European Homicide Monitor, a monitoring system that is very much compatible to the ICCS, but has a bit more detail in the sense that it includes both perpetrator-based analyses, victim-based characteristics, but also case-based characteristics, and now includes over 90 variables that can very well capture in a very detailed way each homicide taking place in these countries. And we've now been able to expand it not only in detail, but also in terms of time, in that we have data over the last 25 years, so going back to 1992 and onwards. So we're very, very proud of that, and also my thanks goes to my colleagues who have been working very hard with me on this. Now, because there's data on all these different levels, we are also able to track homicide cases flowing through the system. And Manuel already briefly introduced this, and I will quickly go over this. So if we start off with a suspicious death recorded by criminal justice agencies, each of these steps in the process, in the criminal justice process, is involved with data loss, right? So to start off with the first step, from a suspicious death to a investigation, some cases are lost because they are deemed suicides, because they are considered accidents, because they're taken place abroad, or simply because the cause of death remains unknown. Now, if we go to the second step, in terms of clearance, there's data loss both when we look at victims that remain unidentified and hence the perpetrator cannot be apprehended either, and also cases in which the victim identity is known but police simply do not have enough information to hold the suspect. And I will go deeper into this step in more detail a little bit later. But let us first take a look at another step in the process in which data is lost, and that is that of arrest, right? So some suspects die before they can be arrested. Some suspects are underage and cannot be arrested. Homicides committed by the police are generally flowing out of the system. And again, sometimes suspects are known, but they are missing, they're staying abroad, and cannot be apprehended. Then when we go to the next step in terms of prosecution, again, some suspects die, sometimes the prosecutor doesn't have enough evidence, or this person is convicted of another crime and hence disappears out of the homicide flow and enters another crime flow. And the same accounts for sentencing. Sometimes people are not found to be guilty for a homicide or for another crime, or are deemed not guilty for reasons of insanity, kill out of self-defense, and hence flow out of the system. And the final step involves imprisonment. Not all of those who are eventually sentenced also serve a prison term. Some are treated or dealt with in other ways in and outside of the criminal justice system. Now, one may question to what extent each of these steps in the criminal justice system represents a bias, right? To what extent is the data loss in each of these steps biased? Now, there's two schools of thought on this. One is a so-called discretionary school, pointing to discretionary factors, such as the likability of victims, stating that some victims receive more law than other victims, and hence homicide cases are cleared, for some categories of victims are cleared in higher or more ways than homicides of less likable victims. Then the other school of thought points to non-discretionary factors and simply states that it is police capacity or physical evidence that is lacking why a homicide gets cleared or not. Now, we try to test this assumption based on our data from the European Homicide Monitor, focusing on clearance. So let me just share with you some of the first results. So again, here's a map of Europe in which we find that homicide rates throughout the period that we studied ranged from 0.47 per 100,000 in Switzerland to about 2 per 100,000 in Finland. So specifically, globally speaking, these are very, very low rates. The clearance rate ranged from about 77% in the Netherlands to 98% in Finland, right? So almost all homicides in Finland in that period of time were cleared. Now, again, going back to these discretionary versus non-discretionary factors, what did we find? We found that it was actually not an either-or, right, but rather a combination of both discretionary as well as non-discretionary factors. So if there's a very young victim involved, it decreases the likelihood of a homicide being solved. So think, for example, of neonaticides, right? Newborn children that are found. Very hard to clear those type of cases. Whereas when there's a female victim or an ethnic majority victim, the likelihood of a homicide being cleared goes up. If we look at non-discretionary factors, it was actually homicides taking place in a public area and homicides being committed by a firearm that lower the likelihood of a homicide taking place. So these factors combined also very much reflect the type of homicide that we're looking at, right? So domestic homicides overall having a higher clearance rate compared to criminal homicides or homicides committed in a criminal context, usually in a public area by a firearm with a male victim. All right, well, what we'd like to do next is to look really into depth in some of the other stages of the homicide flow, and also to counter, to look at the factor time, right? So how long does it actually take between the moment a suspicious death is registered to ultimately sanctioning of the suspect. And also, what we have not yet been able to do is to link our criminal justice data to public health data, to see if there's cause of death, if there's a discrepancy between cause of death data and criminal justice data. And then finally, we are now also expanding the monitor not only to other European countries, but also to areas in the Caribbean where homicide rates are much, much higher, to assess homicide flows through the system in those areas as well. I'd like to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention. We'd love to talk more during this conference about hypothetical ideas and also about the ways in which the European Homicide Monitor can be implemented elsewhere. Thank you.
Right, let me begin just by saying good afternoon to everybody. I'm most grateful for the invitation. It really is a pleasure to be among colleagues that share an interest in collecting good data. I didn't realize that there were so many of you. It often feels like we work in a very isolated vacuum when we're doing this work. So going back to Manuel's initial slide, the format has changed somewhat, but the content is very much the same. Unfortunately, I'm going to be speaking very much around the first two dimensions about collecting the information, collecting accurate homicide data. But it is really important to have a solid foundation to begin this work. Here we go. This study is going to be the presentation is going to be drawing on a study that we conducted around 2012, 2013 in South Africa. The results are published for 2009, but what this represents is the first representative sample of an injury profile, an injury mortality profile, including homicides for South Africa. It was a multi-stage random sample of mortuaries, which were stratified by urban and non-urban areas and by mortuary size. But the main purpose of this study was to inform our national burden of disease study. It's important to note we have a national study, which is not the global burden of disease, which some of you might be familiar with. So where do I put this? Sorry, we're out of batteries on the remote. Can you pause the time as well, please? I can try and speak off the cuff, but I don't remember the word. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So the question is, why did we bother to go to all of this effort? Firstly, there's skepticism about data from invested agencies in the state sector, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. There are potential conflicts of interest and uncertainty about the quality of data systems. This is particularly the case for road traffic injuries in South Africa, less so for homicides, but I know that that's a problem in other contexts. We also have no institutionalized injury mortality surveillance in South Africa. We've done some very good pilot studies that's given us an idea, but this has not been sustained over time, and those pilot projects didn't have national coverage. And then, despite the fact that vital registration in South Africa has high levels of completeness, the cause profile for injuries is very unreliable. In fact, it's not believable. Oops. Oh, yeah. Okay. So the mortality statistics, the vital registration is based on the death notification that a doctor or the coroner completes. It's very good in urban areas, but less so it's very complete in urban areas, but less so in rural areas. We've noted problems before with the quality of the death notification system, particularly around HIV/AIDS deaths in South Africa, and other causes, including injury causes. Now, it's important to note that for injuries, there are two dimensions that are important. The external cause, which is the mechanism by which someone dies, and then the apparent manner, or the manner of death, which talks about intent, so whether it's unintentional or intentional, which is a homicide or a suicide, or in fact undetermined. Now, we've noted that in the case of vital registration, there's a lot of, there's very poor data quality. We really don't believe this profile. Sorry, the slide is leaching in. But if you look at vital registration data coming from official sources, they estimate that homicide, I'm not sure if you can read the font, but it's the blue, it is the blue bar that we need to look at. They're saying 10.3% of all non-natural deaths, which is equivalent to just 5,000 homicides. Now, the police themselves report 16,000, and the survey that we completed showed that there were, in fact, well, our estimates are in the region of 19,000. Okay. So if you look at the profile arising from our study, it's on the left. And you can see that by using the system of the post-mortem report, we were able to attribute considerably more of the deaths that were otherwise in this, what we call a garbage code of other unintentional injuries and undetermined deaths, and distribute them across other causes. As a case in point, we can draw on a study. We're doing an intervention study, evaluation study on a gun control intervention. And the firearm lobby pointed out that there were practically no gun deaths included in the official statistics. So, sorry. Okay, so most of these, we have a problem with, oh dear. Sorry, my presentation seems to have been corrupted slightly. What we're expecting to find is that most firearm deaths would be included in these ICD categories, which are intentional and suicide. And in fact, most of them are ending up in this undetermined and accidental category. All right, so, and we will see that in 2006, whereas the majority of deaths were listed as undetermined intent, were unintentional, they leapt to undetermined intent at around 2006. And there's no other reason for this happening than the arbitrary reallocation of these gunshot injuries from an undetermined to an unintentional cause category, which really is the result of a new coding rule from 2007, which was applied, which was cited in our death notification report. Now, I'm not sure if this coding norm is something that's been influenced by lobbying groups such as the National Rifle Association in the US, but perhaps more likely it's the case that people or countries that are enthusiastic about coding, so if we consider first world countries where there are gun deaths, it's much more likely that if there isn't a description of the intent, that it is in fact an accidental death or an unintentional death. Whereas in a high violence context such as South Africa, it's in fact far more likely that that death is an intentional death. Right, so this poor quality, I'm sorry about the text boxes. Everything has been slightly corrupted. I think it's Mac versus PC. But the profile we had looked at earlier from our study is on the right. And the wider implication of this poor vital registration data is that it gets fed into things such as the Global Burden of Disease study, which recognizes the poor coding and then redistributes according to their algorithms. Now, these were the initial estimates they provided. And they've done a fairly good job in redistributing other categories because they're used to this kind of thing and having to reassign codes. But we did point out the massive discrepancy in homicide statistics, which they corrected. Unfortunately, everything else is still inaccurate. This was in 2010, but to their credit, in the latest study, the cause of death profile looks very much like this one. So there's really the wider implications of doing this kind of work. Okay, now that I've shown you the results, a little bit on the method. So the data were extracted from mortuary dockets, and these included the post-mortem report from forensic pathologists, death certificates, and police and hospital records. The field workers were trained to review these post-mortem reports to retrieve demographics and information on cause of death. And they were trained by forensic pathologists too, which is really important. We used mobile phones for on-site data capture, which gave us real-time monitoring. And we did some reliability testing and found that they were done very well with the cause of death aspect in particular. Very briefly, the scope of the study. There are approximately 600,000 deaths in South Africa, and the ones that present to mortuaries are about 66,000. So for our study, we sampled 32,000, just to give you a sense of the size of the study, but it's about 5% of all deaths. The strengths of this, firstly, it provides a more realistic injury profile, one that we believe. The post-mortem reports include the forensic pathology assessment, which death notification does not. And this is before the inquest, but at the time of death, this is probably the gold standard. The forensic pathologists are central to the investigation process, and they're frequently used to lead evidence in court proceedings, so they know how to apportion deaths accurately. It is possible to link and validate vital registration and police records from this approach. We didn't do that, and it's achievable in a small time frame. The weakness, of course, is that this is an intermittent approach. So we have data for 2009, and we will do the next study for 2018. It's expensive, so it's a particular outlay for a particular project. There's limited detail on the victim and perpetrator, and it's delayed as well, because we have to wait for proceedings to resolve, so you can only do the study 2 to 4 years, depending on the information required. My very last slide, and this speaks to some of the other aspects that Manuel raised at the beginning. We are teaming up for the next round of the study, which we will do later this year or next year, with colleagues that have done in-depth studies on intimate partner violence in South Africa and homicide in particular. And what we will be doing in the injury mortality study is collecting additional information. So information on blood alcohol and additional information on the perpetrator, as well as the information on the victim, and I suppose later on we could also look at whether cases have been resolved in the time frame that we are considering. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
So, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Manuel, for inviting me for this conference, and thanks, Salome, for arranging all the details. I hope I will not give such a work for the translator. So today I will be presenting the research that we published last year regarding the flow of homicide cases in a Brazilian city. And in the flow, it was an attempt to reconstruct the flow between 2003 and 2013. So nowadays, last year, Brazil had almost 6,000 intentional deaths. However, and we still rely much more on the health records than in police records. And my colleague Dorian will explain this much better on Wednesday. However, we lack a national crime justice statistics system. It means that every time that we want to reconstruct the flow of homicide cases, we have to to gather data in specific organizations. It also implies that studies reconstructing the flow of homicide cases in Brazil are very focused on specific cities, which means that we do not have national studies regarding how the flow of homicide cases work in Brazil. So Manuel has already presented the flow of murder cases in general. I would like to make three specific highlights regarding the Brazilian situation, which means that our police investigation is still an inquisitorial phase. It means that during the police investigation, the defense and the public prosecutor do not participate in these activities. So once the case is cleared and the public prosecutor presents charges, all the proofs collected under the police investigation have to be reintroduced to the criminal justice system. So the accusatorial phase can start. Once the judicial phase once all the proofs are reintroduced, the judge can assess if it was really an intentional case or not. If it was an intentional homicide, the case will be forwarded to trial by jury. It means that it takes a lot of time for a case to arrive in the trial by jury. And once the case arrives, usually it is subject to extinction of criminal liability. So to get data regarding the flow of homicide cases, what we have to do is to assess the documents related to the police investigation and to criminal proceedings itself. Usually we reconstruct the flow from the behind. And using this technique, we are able to understand the defendant and victim's characteristics, the length of time for each phase, the total time for criminal proceedings, and the final disposition. So basically, it was what we did in these last studies in Belo Horizonte, which is the city showed in the map. It's one of the major capitals in Brazil, and we took into consideration cases that were not cleared and cases that were cleared, and gathering information from this document, we were able to reconstruct this flow of murder cases. For every 100 police records in Belo Horizonte, only 20% will become charges. This percentage is very similar to research carried out in other Brazilian states or Brazilian cities, which usually the charge represents something between 4 and 50% of all intentional homicides recorded in Brazil. It's very different from the data presented by my colleague before. From the charges, only a percentage will be subject to trial by jury. And from the cases brought to trial by jury, 39% will lead to a conviction, which is again a rate very similar to the ones gotten in other research. The main variable that interferes in the likelihood of conviction is extinction of criminal liability, especially the length of time of criminal proceedings. So, in this first phase of our research, what we did was to try to understand what variables would influence the likelihood of clearance. And we took into consideration the victim's characteristics, the crime characteristics, and the investigation characteristics. What we would assess is that the crime characteristics not only decrease the likelihood of clearance, but also increase the length of time of police investigation. Also, two variables related to police investigations not only increase the likelihood of clearance, but also decrease the length of time. And they are, if the case has witness to the fact, and if the defendant was caught in the act. Here we can see the effect of the defendant being caught in the act. Usually, a successful police investigation lasts much more, lasts more than 2,500 days, and successful police investigation lasts around 500 days. We are talking about more than a year just to have a successful police investigation that will become a charge. Once the charges are presented, what we can see is that the crime characteristics, that the crimes that will become part of criminal proceedings are very different from the ones recorded into the police. And also, since all the investigation has to be reintroduced to the criminal justice system, the characteristics are pretty similar with the exception of the defendants that were caught in the act. During the trial, 30% of the defendants died, and 7% are victim of another murder crime. And it happens mainly because of the length of time of criminal proceedings. Usually in Belo Horizonte, a criminal proceeding of homicides lasts 11 years. And the longer the length of time, the higher the likelihood of extinction of criminal liability. In our research, we could assess that 13% the extinction of criminal liability was due to the defendant death, and 24% was due to statute of limitation. The proceeding took so long that the state will not be able to punish the defendant anymore. So in the last phase of our research, we try to understand the determinants of the convictions, what makes a case subject to convictions and not subject to it. And of course, we took into consideration only cases that survived until this phase, and take into account the defendant characteristics, the incident characteristics, and the police investigations that were again introduced into trial by jury. The variables that increase the likelihood of the conviction and decrease the length of time of criminal proceedings are basically the same if the defendant was caught in the act and if the case has a witness to the fact. So these two variables are the most important in the flow of murder cases in Belo Horizonte. So in summary, from each 100 murders recorded by the police forces in Belo Horizonte, only 6 will be punished. These results are very similar to other research and studies carried out in other Brazilian cities and in other states. Crimes in which the victims were killed at night, during the use of weapons, in public spaces, and in cases that the police forces affirmed that the victim was killed because she or he was involved in other drug crimes, are more likely to not be cleared. The variables that really interfere in this likelihood of clearance are witness to the fact and cause definite in the act. Homicide proceeds last on average 11 years, and this is it is very similar again to other studies. And because the proceeding takes so long, it is very difficult to produce valid results, and this is why only 39 of homicide proceedings produce valid convictions. And the longer the length of time, the higher the likelihood of popular justice. 7% of the defendants were murdered before the final disposition, and in some of these proceedings, the justification of the murder of the defendant was that the justice will never come to this case. Thank you.
Hello, I work at INEGI, at the National Institute for Statistics and Geography in Mexico, and I will present statistics on homicide, intentional homicide. Well, this is the flow, the process. I believe we have heard about that, so I will skip. And this also continues with the flow and the type of documents and the documentation we have on records, so we can make statistics. So I will just pass this as well. Well, this is the statistics coming from the health system. This is the series from 1990 to 2016 in Mexico. As you can see, well, in the middle, we have the total rate per 100,000 inhabitants. And in 1990, it was about around 17 per 100,000. And then it began to diminish until 2007 with 8. And then from that point, we started to have a rapidly increase in the rate that had its peak in 2011 with 24 per 100,000 inhabitants. The upper one is men, and the one below is women. And the other source that we have from for homicide statistics is the one coming from the criminal justice system. This was instituted in 1997. We have these statistics since then, and this is on a monthly basis. The one on health statistics is only on annual basis. So we have here the same the same flow. We coming from 1997 again, coming down until 2007, and then the increase, just as in the other one. And this is a comparison between those two statistics, but with in the case of criminal justice, instead of having reports, that was the previous slide, we have victims. So it's more, we can compare, but this was only from 2014, since the criminal justice systems began collecting also statistics on victims. And as you can see, the rates are getting closer. And on the last, on 2016, which is the latest available for health statistics, it was 20, and almost it was 19 in the criminal justice system, the rate per 100,000 inhabitants. Well, now some figures around the flow and the numbers coming from each of the authority in the criminal justice systems that we can collect information from them. On the left, you can see records from the police, which is an authority in Mexico which has certain functions, but is not the official records for crime. The official records come from the public prosecutor's offices, which is the one on the right, and which is the numbers that we were seeing before with the comparison between the criminal justice system and the health system with the death certificate, which we can make the statistics. So then the numbers, there's a big difference between them. And again, this is the flow coming from the summing up this the process. And numbers again. These numbers, the first two columns shows records from the police. So between the state police and municipal level police, we have around 11,000 homicides registered, while in the public prosecution offices, we have for crimes, intentional homicides, around 19,000, and we have more than 23,500 victims recorded in those for those crimes for homicide. And then we have in the courts around 4,400 defendants, and this is from 2016. All this information, but the people that goes into the penitentiary centers are more than double, mainly because those that figure includes not only intentional homicide but also other types of manslaughter. Then continuing in the criminal justice systems with public prosecution statistics, we have on the left the investigations open for homicide. We can see numbers around 820,000 to 19,000. And those that are cleared, then we have this around 8,000 in 2014, 2015, and in 2016 we have less than 5,000. The rest is pending investigations. And then we have the courts. In the courts, we have around 2014. This is important to mention that we have homicide and femicide, putting together these two crime types. We have in 2016 less than 5,000 defendants charged for homicide and femicide, and then we have for ongoing processes in 2016 around 2,000, almost 3,000, and concluded we have around in total 3,000. And then we have the sentences. Absolutory we have around 300 to 200 between 2014 and 2016, and those sentenced with that was have a sentence in a condemnatory decision, we have from 2,000 to 1,200 in 2016. About the relation between the cases and cases cleared, we have on the left the percentage of cases cleared from those that were initiated. We have in 2014 almost 30%, and in 2016 we have 15%. And on the right, we can see the proportion of sentences to the cases cleared. And it's around 30% in 2014 and 2016. And now another relation between the data. In this case is the same as I presented before between the health system and the criminal justice system. But in this time is absolute figures. We can see that the numbers are getting closer, fortunately, between the death certificates and the criminal justice system in the prosecutor's officers. And we are about to release in the statistical office in 1 month the number, the figure for that is preliminary, because the definite numbers are released in October, but will be very close to those 90,000, around almost 30,000 for 2017. And another difference between the numbers that I mentioned before are those, the accused, those people charged for homicide, and the people that get into the penitentiaries centers. And the difference I mentioned before, it's because in prisons they don't have the disaggregation between intentional and unintentional homicides. Well, just to conclude, for conclusions, well, there are certain limitations for measuring homicide in Mexico. There is a possibility of a hidden figure, certainly. There are records of disappearance in our country, which cannot add up to the homicide figures. And different definitions femicide, it's an issue in Mexico. It's something to be followed up, so we have to be clear about the criteria and the differences between homicide and femicide. Also, there are issues about capacity. We have in Mexico 32 states, that means 32 prosecution officers, and also courts, so we have different capacities in order to collect information coming from them. And disaggregation is very important to have disaggregations and we'll be able to relate the different records between police, prosecutors, and courts, which is unfortunately not available yet in Mexico. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
They are my slides. Hello everyone, thank you to Manuel and the organisers for inviting me to speak here today. I'm here to tell you about the Home Office Homicide Index, a record level data set of homicides recorded by the police in England and Wales. I'll start with a brief history of the Homicide Index. It began formally in 1946 when the Home Office started collecting paper records on murder offences, and it was expanded to all homicide offences in 1967 to include manslaughter as well. In 1977, an electronic database was established. At first, it continued to be populated by paper records which were manually entered to the database into an automated upload system was introduced in 2007, and that's when we stopped collecting paper files. And the system we have from 2007 is pretty much the same system we have now. Although the Homicide Index started in 1946, the first report published by the Home Office on Homicide was in 1930. These days, the Office for National Statistics publishes the report on homicide, although it's statisticians in the Home Office who collect and analyse the data and draft the report before it's passed over to the ONS, where they claim all the glory. This is the first request for data we have from about 1929-1930 on the left-hand side of the slide, and one of the first returns that we received. So this is when we started collecting detailed data centrally within the Home Office. Fast forwarding on now, this is what a homicide form looks like now, or part of it at least. The police fill out an Excel spreadsheet, which if you were to print it out would be about 12 pages long. So far more data collected now than previously. The forms are sent in by the 43 territorial police forces and the British Transport Police. The police are required to send a form within 30 days of homicide being recorded, then again within 30 days of a suspect or more than one suspect being charged, and again within 30 days of a final court outcome. The police are pretty good at sending in the forms when the homicide is recorded and when a suspect is being charged. They are less good at sending in information on final court outcomes. And this is because these data are held by the Ministry of Justice rather than the police, so they have to put a bit of effort in to get the information. We are doing work with the Ministry of Justice to improve the court outcome data that we hold. The next slide shows some of the data fields held in the Homicide Index, although certainly not all. There's plenty of additional information that's not listed here. Some of the key fields are the method of killing, the relationship between the victim and suspect, the circumstances of the homicide, such as whether the killing was a result of a fight or loss of temper, or during the committing of another offence, such as a robbery. And there's also quite a lot of binary information, things such as whether the homicide was gang-related or involved drugs, and the police can just tick yes or no for quite a long list of various characteristics. The Homicide Index also includes a lot of information on victim and suspect characteristics, including names, date of birth, country of birth, ethnicity, and even their employment status. And for suspects, whether there was a previous serious conviction or a previous conviction for homicide. Lastly, quite a lot of information is collected on the court outcomes, including the verdict, whether the suspect was convicted and of what offence, as well as the length of the sentence and whether an appeal was lodged. So in total, well over 100 fields of information for each homicide that is committed. I'll move on to the methodology now. Firstly, the Homicide Index is based on the date that the offence is recorded by the police, not the date the offence took place. It is also based on the number of victims and not the number of incidents. So this can lead to spikes in homicide trends, given the relatively low number of homicides that we have, between 500 to 700 a year over the last few years. A couple of examples of this. In 2002-03, an inquiry attributed 172 killings to Harold Shipman, a doctor in the north of England who is the most prolific serial killer we've seen in England. It's thought he killed well over 200 patients over 23 years, normally by lethal injections of morphine to elderly patients. After the result of this inquiry, these 172 homicides were recorded in 1 year. And in a similar manner, in a very different case, the 96 deaths at the Hillsborough football disaster in 1989 were only recorded in 2016 following another public inquiry. There are also 2 measures of homicide that are published, initially recorded and currently recorded. Assuming someone is charged with the offence and taken to court, it is the court that ultimately decides the outcome of the case. While most homicide cases lead to conviction in homicide, in some cases a suspect may be acquitted, for example in the case of self-defence. In these cases, the homicide would be classified as not a homicide, hence the 2 measures. The measure we use most often is currently recorded homicides, and when we receive the data from the police, we run a lot of data checks, some of them fairly basic, for example on an infanticide to make sure the relationship is mother and that the victim is aged under 1, which it has to be legally defined an infanticide. Given that a lot of these forms are completed by investigating officers, and this is a large admin data set, we do have quite a lot of data errors, and we go back to the police many times to try and get the data corrected. So what is a homicide index used for? Well, firstly, as previously mentioned, there's an annual statistical publication on homicide published by the Office for National Statistics, which gives information on the latest year as well as trends in homicides. Homicide index is also used operationally. We provide information to the police to assist their inquiries, including information on cold case reviews, which can involve a trip down to the basement to look over old paper records. We've also provided data recently to the National Crime Agency in their development of a homicide prevention strategy, and this work is ongoing. We use the data internally as well, most recently for a government serious violence strategy, which was published a couple of months ago, which I'll talk about in a bit. And again, with the National Crime Agency, we supply data to populate databases which they use for law enforcement purposes, including a database called CATCHM, which is a blatantly constructed acronym and stands for Centralised Analytical Team Collating Homicide Expertise and Management. We answer parliamentary questions. Any member of Parliament can table a question on any subject to the government of the day, which we have to reply to, and we get plenty of inquiries from the public as well. And we also provide data to academia for research, including from many doctorates. It's quite a burden for my small team to provide data, but we are, of course, happy to consider cases and to provide data that could improve the understanding of homicide. Okay, some headline findings now. This shows a trend in homicide since the 1960s by rate per million population. The general trend was upwards into the early 2000s, followed by quite a sharp fall for over a decade, for an increase we've seen in the last couple of years. I mentioned earlier Harold Shipman and Hillsborough, and you can see on this chart the effect these incidents have had on the homicide trend. The trend in homicide, the rate of population in homicide peaked in 2002-03, but if you take out the Harold Shipman homicide in this year, then the peak was actually a year earlier. This chart shows a more medium trend. What's quite interesting here is you can see that the trends in homicide recently have been driven by changes in the level of male victims. Female victims have been relatively stable and have been falling very slightly, with around about half of all female victims killed by a partner or an ex-partner. We also don't see any increase in female homicides, particularly for the last couple of years, but we do see a reasonably sharp increase in these homicides, which are often based on acquaintances between the victim and the suspect. I've put this slide in here because I'm aware that homicides in England and Wales may be quite different to some other countries' experiences. Year after year, the most common method of killing someone in England and Wales is by a sharp instrument, and we have a relatively low number of shooting homicides compared to other countries, and that's largely due to the restrictive gun laws that are in the UK. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and a US presenter was saying that around a third of their domestic homicides involve a gun. Well, that just doesn't really happen in the UK. I mentioned that the Home Office published a serious violence strategy a couple of months ago. As part of this, we looked at homicide trends, as well as trends in knife crime, gun crime and robbery as a measure of serious violence, and these have all increased over the last couple of years. This table is lifted from the strategy and shows there's been an increase in the number of homicides where drugs have, in one way or another, been involved, from 206 to 247, or from 50% of homicides to 57% of all homicides. This, combined with other evidence, suggests that drugs have been a key driver in the increase in serious violence we've seen in England and Wales in the last couple of years. For example, we've seen an increase in crack cocaine purity in England from 36% in 2013 to 71% in 2016. I've also highlighted the 152 figure here. As the homicide index takes account of court outcomes and homicide investigations can take some time, we don't have as much information as we would like for the most recent increase in homicide. There is always a greater proportion of cases where either no suspect has been charged or a verdict is yet to be reached in more recent homicide cases. And this is shown on this slide. For the most recent year, 2016-17, of the 617 suspects charged relating to the 719 homicides recorded in that year, and remembering there can be more than one suspect per homicide, around half, 51%, the court proceedings were still pending. Of the cases that had ended, 224 suspects have been convicted of homicide, while 25 have been acquitted, so a conviction rate of around about 90% on the information we have so far. Or another way of looking at it, between 2006-07 and 2013-14, there was someone charged in 9 out of 10 homicides. For 2016-17, that's only 6 in 10. Lastly, the serious violence strategy also looked at international trends in homicide. This table is also lifted from that strategy and shows that many countries showed a fall in homicide, like England and Wales, between 2008 and 2014. And between 2014 and 2016, a number of countries have seen an increase. Not all, but some. So we are very interested in these increases. And due to this, and sorry for the plug, an international symposium will be held in the UK on serious violence in autumn this year, with the intention to learn more about why a number of countries are beginning to see an increase in homicide and serious violence in general, and what we can do about it. So hopefully we'll be able to see some of you there. Thank you.
So thank you very much to all the speakers for these contributions. I personally thought this was quite interesting and really fascinating to see the differences between different countries in the functioning, in the flow of cases. And I think it would be fantastic to have more of this information that can actually be compared across sites. As fascinating as it is to think about homicide statistics, having lunch is also quite important. But there is one question standing between now and lunch. And so we have one question from the audience, Kevin actually. And I read this out. There is the question, the homicide index is a very interesting use of administrative police case data. Could a similar approach be used to generate indices of other areas of interest, such as domestic violence, suicide, and assault? And why or why not is this being pursued?
We have something called the Home Office Data Hub, which is exactly moving towards that sort of situation. The US presenter earlier mentioned sort of like moving to an incident-based system of crime records. We're also moving towards record-level data, so we can do far more analysis on crimes below the level of homicide. So we've had the homicide index for 70 plus years, but it's only relatively recently that we're getting far greater level of detail on other crimes. So going forward, we will be able to do far more analysis on other crimes.
We had one more question. I don't know whom this question is directed to, but I'll just read out the question. Maybe somebody has an answer to this. The question is, what is your opinion about including homicide in national crime victim surveys? I don't know what the answer to this question is. Well, I have a view on this, but...
Well, usually crime victimization surveys do not include homicide. In Mexico, in the first two, we started in INEGI measuring crime victimization in 2011, and in the third year we had a different approach to measure kidnapping, and there, as a control variable, we included homicide and also disappearance. So just to be sure that the number we were in the end coming up as kidnapping was reliable. So we did, and in the first year, the estimate for homicide, which we didn't intend it to measure accurately, it happened to be very, very near from the administrative record, from death certificates numbers, so it is possible.
Can I just ask whether within the panel there is a question that one of the panel members would like to ask somebody else? Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for being patient and listening to us. I wish everybody a great lunch and a further continuation of the conference. Thank you.